Hi guys. Okay, so yeah, welcome to um the final class of the course, which is on Derek Jarman, who was a filmmaker. That's him. He was a costume designer, an artist, a filmmaker, and a writer. And throughout the whole course of his output, um, we can see his engagement with queer subcultures in the UK, where he's from, and around the world. And this comes through in his writing, and his filmmaking in a number of ways. And he's known for having produced a number of of different kinds of films. He produced a number of historical films, which are very well known, such as Caravaggio, another film about the philosopher Wittgenstein. He also made a film about the life of Saint Sebastian, all of whom, Caravaggio and Sebastian, are famously homosexual icons, as well as being famous historical figures. And Jarman is known for having produced these historical works, which pay a lot of attention to the physicality of the kind of historical periods that they're capturing, and also to the sexuality of the characters who feature within them, especially historical characters such as Caravaggio, Sebastian. I mean, Saint Sebastian is a saint, but based on a real person, and Wittgenstein. And throughout Jarman's life, as I say here, he also made more kind of poetic and expressionist films. We could think of The Last of England. I'll show you a clip of The Last of England, actually, if to get a sense of what it's like. It's quite different from, say, from the other films that we might watch, but there's Tilda Swinton in The Last of England, if anyone wants to seek out this film.
What do you see in those heavy waters, I ask? Nothing but a bureaucrat from the ministry poisoning the buttercups
This
with
is
a
Jarman's
new
voice.
defoliant. What's that I hear? The sound of Gershwin on his ghetto blaster. What else? The atom splitting. And the whispering? Half-truths spilling from the minister's case, wriggling in the blinding sun. What are they saying? All's well. No comment. Some of them are silent. Ah, there's the guard. What's the password? Evasion. What else do you see? Lies flowing.
So yeah, this is what I mean when I'm talking about expressionist or poetic film. The Last of England doesn't really have a plot. It's more like a meditation, a series of strikingly beautiful but quite low budget images, very influenced by the rise of what we would call Thatcherism in the UK, and a perceived decline in radical potential amongst the population of the UK as a result of the influence of Thatcherite politics, not just on the way that the country was run, but on the personalities of the people who lived within it. And another of his films, which we won't be looking at in detail, is called Jubilee, which is a film very much about punk and about the punk movement. I'll show you some clips of this from the trailer. Jarman, again, is very invested in subcultures throughout his filmmaking career.
You want to know my story, babe? It's easy. This is the generation who grew up and forgot to lead their lives. They were so busy watching my endless movies.
So yeah, you have a sense in Jarman always both of a subculture, but also of part of Jubilee um, is about the way in which punk and radical subculture, musical subculture in the 70s and the early 80s was in some way always commercialized from the start, and it's a story of a kind of cynicism within the punk movement, as well as itself being kind of an example of cheap to make, dirty but aesthetically striking punk cinema, you can say. So yeah, I think that gives you a sense of the other films that Jarman has in his filmography. And as I say here, if there are any Tilda Swinton fans among you, Tilda Swinton was a major collaborator with Jarman, and she stars in some of his most memorable films. So if there are any Tilda Swinton fans, you should check out the Derek Jarman films in which she features quite heavily, of which there are several. And yeah, Jarman is diagnosed with HIV in 1986, and he will die in 1994, soon after Blue is released, which is his final film. And we'll talk in detail about the relationship between Blue and the Jarman's HIV diagnosis, sorry, and his and the film as an attempt to engage with what we talked about in relation to Kevin Killian and Bassani, as in some way being a crisis of representation in relation to AIDS, not simply a public health crisis, but a crisis of representation. How can we talk about AIDS? How can we think about AIDS? How can we think about this disease, which is, as it's killing hundreds of thousands of millions of people, is also being projected onto a particular demographic of people in a way which obfuscates the capacity to actually deal with it, and which also appears to be feeding into and channeling and motivating some of the most violent impulses in society, the most violent homophobic impulses in society. So we'll talk about that. But the first thing that I want to mention, I thought we would do a bit on Jarman's film of The Tempest, which is a adaptation of Shakespeare. There are a number of well-documented queer adaptations of Shakespeare, or adaptations of Shakespeare which tap into what may be an underlying queer thematic within the writing, or in which directors take over the material and queer it as a verb, you know. So sorry, I didn't set up the extra text, but I'll do it now. So if we talk about to queer something, this is a term which gets used a lot in queer theory. We talk about queering or to queer. And it's in some way to shift something, or to change it in a way that it reveals something underneath the surface, which in some, we could say it puts it into crisis, which in some way puts the object and the society which produced it into crisis, or which reveals something new or unseen about these things. It's a bit wordy, but it's an important word, and we haven't spoken about queering as a verb on this course, so I wanted to do that. And we can think of The Tempest as a kind of queer adaptation of Shakespeare, but we can also think of it as a queering of Shakespeare as well. And yeah, for those of you who know a bit of your Shakespeare, The Tempest. Sorry, we're getting a bit fast. I'll put this over there. The Tempest is often thought about as being his final play. It wasn't technically his final play, but it was one of the plays that he wrote on his own, or one of the last plays, if not the last play that he wrote on his own. And it's a play in which a wizard by the name of Prospero, who features in scene 2 of the play, engineers a tempest, or a storm, or a tempest, in the first scene. In order to, it's revealed that he has engineered this this storm in order to bring a number of people who previously betrayed him to an island on which he's been living with his daughter, after having been exiled. So Prospero, we can look at, I don't have the cast list on this scan, but Prospero was formerly the Duke of Milan. In Act 2 of The Tempest, he tells Miranda, who is his daughter, that Prospero here is talking about himself, and he says, "Thy father was Duke of Milan, and his only heir and princess no worse issued. Miranda was his only heir and princess." So Prospero was formerly Duke of Milan, but he confided all of his power in his brother, Antonio. And Prospero tells Miranda, this is in Act 1, Scene 2 of The Tempest. We won't dwell too much on The Tempest, but it's worth getting a sense of what Jarman is doing with the play in his film. So Prospero tells Miranda in Act 1, Scene 2 that while he was Duke, he spent all of his time studying. He said the liberal arts, which is poetry, a bit of science, philosophy, and it turns out in The Tempest, magic, were what he devoted his time to. And the government I cast upon my brother, which means that he gave all of his duties, or he made sure that Antonio did all of the work of being Duke, while Prospero just spent the whole time studying. He spent his whole time enraptured in books. And it emerges that Antonio made a pact with Alonso, who was the king of Naples, who shows up later. He is in this scene. Alonso, who is the king of Naples. Antonio and Alonso made a pact in order to take over the Duchy of Milan, and kick Prospero out, and they exile him and Miranda to the island on which Prospero is at the start of the play. And the second scene of The Tempest is Prospero explaining all of these things to Miranda, who does not yet know who she is or know how they came to be on the island. She has no memory of being anywhere other than being on the island. And in the first scene, we hear her say, Prospero says that she is ignorant of what thou art, which means that she has no knowledge of her own personal history, and she has only a very faint memory, which she says is rather like a dream than an assurance. So it's so faint that she's not completely sure that it's real, of when she was a princess or when she was a kind of noble character back in Milan. And the trajectory of the Tempest is that Prospero, over the course of the play, uses his magic in order to essentially guide his enemies, the people who were previously responsible for exiling him to the island and taking control of his rightful kingdom. Prospero guides all of these people. First things first, he causes a shipwreck, and then after that, he guides everyone to the center of the island through a series of magic tricks and a series of events. And then finally, just as he is about to say that he will finally carry out his plan, Prospero forgives the people who wronged him. And we have this scene in which Ariel, who is one of Prospero's servants, who is a magical creature on the island that only Prospero can see, and who is the person who does all of the magic tricks for Prospero. Ariel tells Prospero that he should forgive the people who have wronged him, and Prospero says, "The rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance." And he decides that rather than doing whatever plan he had in mind, he will forgive the people who wronged him. And he does so after saying that he will also give up magic and go back to Milan. So we have these lines eventually when Prospero meets up with the people who wronged him again for the first time in a number of years, and he's brought them to the island. And then he says to them, "Let us not burden our remembrance with a heaviness that's gone." So he essentially says that he's forgiven all of them. And then Gonzalo, who is one of the main characters who has come on the island as a result of the shipwreck, but who is also the only kind of good, noble character, who was traveling with Alonso and Antonio, who had both betrayed Prospero, then says some lines that are important for understanding the play, which is that it's a situation in which Prospero his dukedom in a poor isle. So Prospero found his dukedom in a poor isle, and all of us ourselves when no man was his own. So the idea is that throughout the course of the Tempest, people kind of lose themselves, but then they find themselves again, and everything's better for having gone through this feeling of transformation, and that people emerge from the Tempest as better people than they were at the start of the play. And that's part of what the central issue of the play is. It's showing the way in which people can be made better through experience, as part of what Shakespeare wants to argue. And it's also very tied to this idea of forgiveness. But alongside this idea of forgiveness, the play is also very much it's about reasserting a kind of patriarchal order within society as well. Two characters, Miranda and Ferdinand, who is Alonso's son, who survives the shipwreck and then falls in love with Miranda, and Miranda falls in love with him. They marry at the end of the play, and they marry near the end of the play, And we can see moments in the play in which there's a very clear sense that Miranda is property, someone without a huge amount of agency, and that part of Prospero's entire plan is to secure Miranda's status. So Prospero wants Miranda to marry Ferdinand because then the offspring would be Duke of Naples and of Milan. Because remember, Ferdinand is Alonso's son, who is the King of Naples, and Miranda is Prospero's daughter, who is the rightful Duke of Milan. And Prospero uses this language. He says, "Then, as my gift and thine own acquisition worthily purchased, take my daughter. But if thou dost break her virgin knot, before all sanctimonious ceremonies may with full and holy rite be ministered, no sweet aspersions shall the heavens let fall to make this contract grow, but barren hate, sour-eyed disdain, and discord shall bestrew the union of your bed, with weeds so loathly that you shall hate it both." So Prospero essentially gives Miranda his daughter, but then also gives Ferdinand his daughter, but then also insists that the two of them must absolutely follow conventional morality when it comes to sexuality in order for their marriage to be successful. And if they don't, it's suggested that they will suffer from a terribly unhappy marriage. And this is all part of the movement towards forgiveness that we have in the play, and part of the idea that things are being put back in their rightful place by the end of the play. And at the end of the play, everyone goes back to Naples. So Prospero renounces his magic, and he speaks an epilogue, which is what you have at the end of something. And he says, "Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardon the deceiver dwell on this bare island by your spell." So he says to the audience that they have to clap their hands in order to get him home. But when he says, "I have my dukedom got," he means he has received his title again, he's back where he should be, and that everything has kind of been set right as a result of the Prospero's actions and his forgiveness of the other characters, and also as a result of the love between Ferdinand and Miranda, but love which is described and which is couched in wrong document. Couched, which can mean to be covered with, or to be framed by. So a situation of reconciliation, which is very much dependent upon the reassertion of a very clear patriarchal order, whereby the ruling class are where they should be. Prospero is the rightful Duke of Milan, and he's returned back to Milan, and the noble young people, Ferdinand and Miranda, are married. And the final thing we need to consider before we watch Jarman's film is that there are two main servants of Prospero who also have their own kind of character arcs in the film. We have Ariel, who is a character who, as I say, is a spirit, is someone who only Prospero can see, but he's also someone who wants to be free of Prospero. He wants to be away from Prospero. And we see him in Act 1, Scene 2. Ariel originally appears as someone who is very, very excited about the fact that he's working for Prospero. He's the one who made the storm that we see in the first scene of the play. And he says, "To thy strong bidding task Ariel and all his quality." And he talks about how he had been very brilliant, been very exciting in the way that he conducted the storm. And he's clearly very energetic. Again, and we'll bear this in mind when we think about Jarman's presentation of Ariel. But Ariel also has a kind of ambivalent relationship with Prospero in that he continuously asks him when he will be set free. And the reason that Prospero, so he says here, Prospero says, how now, Moody, whatest thou canst demand? And Ariel says, my liberty. He wants to be free from Prospero's commands. And Prospero then reminds him that he is more powerful than Ariel. And he also reminds him that he freed him from a torment. So a torment is like a torture or pain. I think it's the same in French, but and he says that when he found him, he says that when Prospero came to the island with Miranda, having been exiled from Milan, he found Ariel trapped inside a tree because the witch who had lived there previously, called Sycorax, had made Ariel do things that he wasn't able to do, and as punishment had trapped him in an oak. And he says to act her, for thou wast a spirit too delicate to act her earthly and abhorred commands. And she did confine him into a cloven pine, which is a kind of tree. And Ariel was in there for 12 years, during which time the witch died, leaving Ariel stuck in the tree, and it's Prospero who let him out. And Prospero says that because of this, Ariel owes him service, and that he will put him back in the tree if he disobeys him. So he says to Ariel, stop talking about being free. Do what I tell you, and I will let you go eventually. But if thou more murmurest, I will rend an oak and peg thee in his knotty entrails till thou hast howled away 12 winters. So part of the arc of the Tempest is also about Prospero and Ariel's relationship, and it finally ends with Ariel being set free by Prospero. Prospero says, just before the end of the play, that my Ariel chick, that is thy charge. So they charge us to set them off on the way back to Milan. He says, I promise you calm seas and auspicious gales, and sails so expeditious that shall catch your royal fleet far off. So he says he's going to sail everyone back to Milan, and he says, Ariel chick, that is thy charge. Then to the elements be free, and fare thou well. So after that, Ariel can go. So Ariel is free at the end of the play. The other character who serves Prospero is Caliban, who again we see in Jarman's version, but we see a kind of changed Caliban in Jarman's version. And in Jarman's version, so in the original, Caliban is the son of Sycorax, and he's someone who lived on the island before Prospero. And we are introduced to Caliban as someone who is very antagonistic towards Prospero. The first time we see him, he says, as wicked dew as e'er my mother brushed, with raven's feather from an wholesome fen drop on you both, a southwest wind blow on you and blister you all over. So he's very angry with Prospero. He wants him to suffer. And Prospero responds by saying he's going to torture him, essentially, and make him suffer physically as a result of his disobedience. And Caliban is the person who is doing the manual work on Prospero's island. Prospero says, we cannot miss him. He does make our fire, fetch in our wood, and serves in offices that profit us. So he gets the wood, he makes the fires, he helps Prospero do physical work on the island. And he's also someone who Prospero says that he treats badly because he is of an inherently bad character. So he calls Caliban a lying slave, whom stripes may move, not kindness. Stripes here means whips. There's a long tradition in criticism of the Tempest, and this is something that Jarman was criticized for not including in his play, of Caliban as being analogous or an analogy for the colonized subject. So as being the indigenous colonized person who is ruled by a colonizer who is Prospero. Aimé Césaire, the well-known, I'm sure you guys know of Césaire, Martinican poet, wrote a version of the Tempest in which he has Caliban as a black militant leader, essentially, who is committed to overthrowing Prospero through any means necessary and reclaiming his right to the island. But Caliban also embarks on a arc throughout the play, and with Caliban, this arc involves him forming a rebellion with two lower class people who were also in the shipwreck, called Stefano and Trincolo. And in Act 2, Scene 2, they meet up. Caliban begins to worship the two working class characters because they get him drunk, and he believes that they're spirits who have magical liquor. And then he goes along with them. They try to lead an insurrection on the island, but ultimately they're defeated because Prospero is far more powerful than they are. And then Caliban ends the play by saying, "I'll be wise hereafter and seek full grace," which means that he will try to be a good servant. So he also undergoes a kind of transformation. But again, this transformation is about making him into what he's supposed to have been all along. So it's about making him into a servant who is wise, who wants the approval of his master, which is part of what grace means here. And it also has a kind of overtone of conversion to Christianity too. So Caliban is someone who is not Christian, who was actually, we read, born of the devil, and nonetheless ends the play by saying he will seek for grace. So part of the reconciliation that we get at the end of the Tempest, like I say, is also this kind of reaffirmation of all the kinds of social positions that people were supposed to be occupying anyway. Prospero goes back to Milan to be Duke. Ferdinand and Miranda, who were two noble characters, get married, and in getting married, they create an inheritance which will link two noble kingdoms together while also supporting Prospero's legacy. And the good servant is free, Ariel, and the insurrectionary bad servant realizes that he should just be a good servant. So we have a kind of forgiveness in the Tempest. We have a sense of things being back to where they should be, but all of this, and things being better than they were at the start of the play, but all of this is based upon a very, potentially, at least one reading of the play is that it's based upon quite a conservative and heteronormative view of how things should be. So if we're queering the Tempest, and if we're reading Jarman's version of the Tempest, which he made in 1979, as a version which is saying something new, saying something different with Shakespeare, then we're going to be looking at the ways in which these themes within the Tempest are presented, but also challenged within the film version. And we have this quote that Jarman was primarily. I'll put the journal article from which this comes on eCampus too. But we have this quote which suggests that Jarman was primarily invested in the Tempest as a play which was very concerned with an idea of forgiveness. He says, "The concept of forgiveness in the Tempest is what attracted me. It's a rare enough quality and almost absent in our world. To know who your enemies are, but to accept them for who they are, befriend them, and plan for a happier future is something we sorely need." So this idea of a kind of happier future is something which we see really foregrounded in Jarman's version of the film, and one of the ways in which he achieves it is by moving some of the scenes in the play around, in a way which actually foregrounds a sense of a new country almost coming into being, or a new state coming into being, rather than just things returning to how they should be. And we'll talk about that when we look at some specific scenes. But we can begin by drawing attention to some of the ways in which Jarman frames the film. The first and most obvious of which is that the whole thing appears to be Prospero's dream, in Jarman's version. So what have I done with the... We can just watch the opening, which appears to make this fairly clear.
Halfway there.
So we have a intercutting between what looks like stock footage of a ship in a storm and the character of Prospero, who in this version of the play is relatively young, but there are some readings in the original Shakespeare that he's only 45 anyway, so obviously age meant something different when Shakespeare was writing than it does now. So actually that version of Prospero might not be that much younger than he would have been in the play, but blah blah blah, that doesn't matter too much. But we have this sense that that Prospero in some way is dreaming the shipwreck, whereas in the play it's made very clear that the first scene is happening in the real world. We later learn that Prospero has made the shipwreck. He says, we see Miranda has been watching the shipwreck, and she says, if you have done this, if you have caused the shipwreck to happen, then please stop it, Father. And he says, no harm, I have done nothing but in care of thee. So he says, nothing has gone wrong, I've been in control of everything, and I've just made sure that it was okay. And then he tells his plan to Miranda, which is that he caused the shipwreck in order to bring the people to the island. However, we don't get this in Jarman's version. Instead, what we get is what appears to be a kind of dream sequence in which the character, who we will find out later is Prospero, is dreaming the dialogue of the first scene of the Tempest, and Jarman uses this stock footage of the sea in order to show us what appears to be a dreamlike shipwreck. And at the end of the film as well, we also see Prospero asleep again. This is the Ariel character.
The bee sucks, there suck I. In a cowslip bell I'll lie. There I'll couch when owls do cry. On the bat's back I do fly. After summer, merrily, 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 shall I live now, under the blossom that hangs on the bough.
And so the final scene again shows Prospero asleep. But rather than in the play, in which the final scene shows them all returning to the island and Ariel being tasked with just one more thing before he goes away, instead Jarman has Ariel repeat a moment from earlier in the play than the end, in which Prospero says that he is about to be made free, and then Ariel sings this song. But it's not until there's still a long scene, as you can see, there's a scene in between Ariel singing this song, which is when he's excited about being free. So again, we can see him as being, we can see Ariel, the character in Shakespeare, as being very energetic, whereas we see the character and very energetic when he sings a song too, which does not come at the end of the play. But in Jarman's version, we see Ariel as being much more melancholy, I think, when he's singing this. Much more someone who he doesn't appear to be overexcited at the prospect of freedom. And Ariel is a character in Jarman's version who is often appears bored, is often someone who does not share the kind of excitement that Shakespeare's version of the character gives to the audience. Just looking for a particular moment. And he has a strange relationship with Prospero in Jarman's version. So we'll watch this clip.
Say, my spirit, how fares the king and his followers?
All prisoners, sir. They cannot budge till your release. Your charm so strongly works them that if you now beheld them, your affections would become tender.
Dost thou think so, spirit?
And this is a scene in the play which is very important because it's a scene in which, as I said, Ariel convinces Prospero that he should forgive it's at this moment that Prospero says that he will forgive the the people who have wronged him. And we just see the lines that the character in the film just spoke. Your charm so strongly works him that if you now beheld them, your affections will become tender. And Ariel responds by saying, mine would, sir, were I human.
Mine would, sir, were I human.
And mine shall. Hast thou, which art but air, a touch, a feeling of their afflictions, and shall not myself, one of their kind, that relishes all as sharply, be kindlier moved than thou art? Though their high wrongs have struck me to the quick, yet with my nobler reason, against my fury, do I take part. The rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. They being penitent, the sole drift of my purpose extend not a frown further. My charms I'll break, their senses I'll restore, and they shall be themselves.
Ariel is also very sarcastic in Jarman's version. And we see that when he turns his head, he's also just that. He's also, we don't see that so well here, but I'll find another shot. He's also quite clearly queer coded in the sense that he wears an earring. He's somewhat feminized throughout the film. And there are readings of the film to suggest that Ariel is presented by Jarman as maybe we'll see it at the end, as a character who is working through, or presents Prospero as working through. This is a better shot of him. Working through of a kind of repressed desire or homosexuality, which is not fully able to deal with or to confront. And especially if we read the film as a dream, and if we read the disappearance of Ariel at the end of the film as being the film's real conclusion, then this may mean that Prospero wakes up to a new world in which he is able to live as a kind of whole person, as if he no longer needs Ariel within Jarman's vision of what the new world that the action of the Tempest brings about will be, either in reality or in kind of Prospero's personality. Another major change in the film is the presentation of Ferdinand, who, if we remember, is the king's son, who is believed to have been killed in the shipwreck, or who his father believes to have been killed in the shipwreck, but who actually has been saved and is then made to marry Miranda. And we see him in the play, we see him being led by Ariel towards the end of Act 1, Scene 2, after Caliban is introduced as a character. Ferdinand is led by Ariel, who is singing a strange song. And Ferdinand comes onto stage and immediately sees Miranda and falls in love with Miranda, and Miranda falls in love with him. And remember, they're both noble characters, so there's something about the fact that they fall in love so easily, which represents this kind of innate nobility. And again, it's a relatively conservative, if not extremely conservative, vision, in the sense that two characters from noble families, even though they have no knowledge of each other, immediately recognize a kind of mutual nobility within each other, and as a result of that, fall in love. It's what we would call an essentialist vision. But notice the way that Jarman, he eroticizes, I think, objectifies Ferdinand's body. Ferdinand is presented to the gaze of the viewer. He's muscular as he's coming out of the ocean. He is entirely naked. And again, we see a kind of bored Ariel who sings a song, which is a song that we see him singing when in the play when he enters in with Ferdinand. In the film, we see Ferdinand coming out of the ocean with Ariel singing the song.
Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell. Ding dong, ding dong, bang. Where should this music be? The air or the earth? Sounds no more. Sure, it waits upon some god of the island, sitting on a bank.
And we see Ferdinand as well as a much more isolated, vulnerable presence than we see him as in the play. In the play, when Ariel sings that song, he is guiding Ferdinand to his kind of destiny, which is to meet Miranda, or to the destiny that Prospero is engineering, which is that he will meet Miranda, fall in love, and return to the island. He's on the island. Return to Milan or Naples. Here, in Jarman's version, we see Ferdinand alone, vulnerable. He hears the song, but it doesn't really lead him anywhere. He's sitting naked, cold, on a sandbank.
Laying both their fury and my passion with its sweet air.
And then he moves into the house, where the whole film is set, as you'll have noticed, those of you who have watched it. Rather than being set on an island, the film is set all within the same house. And again, Ferdinand falls asleep next to a fire, naked, as I think an eroticized male body. Whereas often it's Miranda who is the one who is most objectified within the play. And I mentioned the quotation at the start of the class, in which Prospero says to Ferdinand that he is giving Miranda as his, essentially as his gift. And thine own, as my gift and thine own acquisition, worthily purchased, take my daughter. In Jarman's version, there's much more of a sense that Ferdinand is the objectified one. And we also see this, we see a similar distinction in Miranda, who in Jarman's film version has a very different relationship to Caliban than she does in the play as well. And this is the actor who was playing Caliban, who we also saw in Jubilee. Again, along with Tilda Swinton, he's one of the most frequent actors, one of the actors to appear most frequently in Jarman's films. And we see Miranda washing and in the play, we hear that Miranda has an interaction with Caliban, in which she says that Caliban is a devil "'Tis a villain, sir, I do not love to look on," which is how Miranda views Caliban when Prospero says that we're going to go and talk to Caliban now, in Act 1, Scene 2. And then we hear later on in the scene that Caliban tried to assault Miranda, that he didst seek to violate the honor of my child. And Caliban doesn't deny it. This isn't something which features in Jarman's film. And Miranda calls Caliban an abhorred slave, which any print of goodness will not take, which means that there's no way of making Caliban better, a better person. He's just someone who is just bad to the bone and just needs to be dominated by force rather than by any kind of education. And he's kind of threatening to Miranda. As much as he's also a bit of a clown, he's threatening, and he's someone who, if we read the play literally, tried to rape Miranda earlier. And it's this fact which justifies the treatment of Caliban by Prospero within the play. But within the Jarman version, again, we see a very different relationship. We see a different Miranda, who is perhaps more playful. I would argue has more agency. And her relationship to Caliban is different. So it's obvious that Caliban bothers her, but it's treated as fun. They have a kind of playfully antagonistic relationship, and she laughs afterwards as well. And something that this film does is it folds relationships which within the original play exist in very distinct parts of the island onto themselves in a way which means that everything is happening, give or take, within the same house. And that, I think, creates a sense that figures like Caliban, who exist on one side of the island, are brought into a relationship with other characters just by their very proximity, and they mean different things in the film than they mean in the play. Especially if we think of this as being a dream, if we think of this as being something that Prospero is, as being a result of the Prospero character's unconscious. And this is a scene that I want to think about as well, because it's a scene in the play, in the film, in which Miranda and Prospero talk, and in which Prospero tells Miranda her backstory. But within the film, it happens after 34 minutes, so it's not at the start at all. And if we notice that in this scene, Caliban is also in the background, and they're sharing a house together. In the Tempest, the play, it's much more the case that Caliban lives on his side of the island and is very heavily policed and does not enter into Prospero's side of the island, whereas in the film they intermingle much more and they cross the same space. And here we see Caliban in the background as Miranda and Prospero are talking.
You've often begun to tell me what I am, but stopped, concluding stay, not yet.
The hour's now come. The very minute bids thee ope thine ear. Obey, and be attentive. 12 years since, Miranda. 12 years since. My father was the Duke of Milan and a prince of power.
By heavens, what foul play had we that we came from thence?
Being transported, wrapped in secret studies, the government...
So Prospero at this point is reciting the speech from Act 1, Scene 2, in which he describes the describes the exile and the betrayal by his brother Antonio. We just heard Miranda say, "What foul play had we there? That we came from thence or hence," that should read. And notice that in Jarman's version, Caliban is calmly watching in the background. So there's a sense that they are all existing together in the same space, in the same house, in the same framework. And maybe part of what happens at the end of the film is that these things become integrated into Prospero and into the world that is created, the new world which is created through the kind of act of forgiveness that happens at the end of the play.
Cast upon my brother, and to my state became stranger. Thy false uncle.
Antonio?
And again, in the play, when we see this, Prospero is usually depicted as being very angry, as being cranky, as being quite full of hatred for his brother. But Jarman, again, there's something quite unearthly, there's something quite surreal, and there's something quite dreamlike about this moment in the film, which suggests, I think, almost something kind of performative about the speech and about the things that it's describing too. It's visually quite strikingly beautiful as well. It's less invested, I think, in the kinds of social hierarchies which it's talking about than Shakespeare's original play is. Part of like what we could say is straight or conventional reading of the Tempest is that you have to believe that it's fundamentally wrong for a noble person to lose their position of power through betrayal. That has to be morally appalling to the audience in order for them to find Prospero's act of forgiveness very, very noble by the end of the play, and in order for the fact that everyone goes back to their basic hierarchy, to their position in the hierarchy, to be a very happy and good ending. You have to be invested in that in order for the original play, as it would have worked in the 17th century, to really work. I don't think Jarman is really invested in that kind of morality. And when we see these scenes, it's as much about the kind of spatial relations that we get between Caliban, Prospero, and Miranda as it is about the story which is being told. And even the story itself is presented in a way that feels unearthly and odd.
I pray thee, mark me that a brother should be so perfidious. He, being thus lauded, not only with what my revenue yields.
And we have a moment later in the scene in which we have a flashback to them.
It's you from heaven.
I pray you, sir, for still 'tis beating in my mind your reason for...
Miranda looks in a mirror and they see them as they were. They see each other as they were back in Milan. And it's kind of absurd. Nobody looks like this. This is not a representation of an actual hierarchy. This is almost like a dream within a dream. And again, Jarman is not trying to produce a moral outrage in the viewer. that Shakespeare may have wanted to produce. He's not trying to get the viewer to invest in the evil nature of Antonio's betrayal of Prospero at all. Rather, what he does is to present this whole thing as more of a dream, as in some ways as much more vivid and beautiful than the house in which we see the rest of the characters living for most of the film. Okay, we need to speed up a little bit. But the final thing that the film does, which is very, very important, is that it moves a scene from Act 4, which is a mask or a performance. Prospero calls it a vanity of mine art. So a vanity being something which is not very significant, something frivolous. To be frivolous is to be unimportant. And Jarman makes it the climax of the film. So in the play, Prospero puts on a show in order to celebrate Ferdinand and Miranda's marriage. For I must bestow upon the eyes of this young couple some vanity of mine art. And we see some spirits perform what's called a mask, which is a kind of dance or performance. And Jarman moves this to the end, and he makes it the climax of the whole film. And this quote from Ellis, I think, is important. And I'll put the article online. He says, "All attention is thereby focused on the spectacle." This is the viewer. The viewer's attention in the film is focused on the spectacle. And the political question of who will rule Milan becomes secondary to the larger issue of the values of the resultant community. These values come largely from the margins of the play and are expressed, as we have seen, through minority aesthetic practices. And then they are practices, moreover, that share a faith in the redeeming power of art and spectacle. So we have this very queer, kind of outrageously queer performance of this song, Stormy Weather, by Florence Welch, who was a very, very well-known nightclub singer on the queer nightclub scene, and she comes in, someone who Jarman would have known and would have seen perform, and sings this version of Stormy Weather, surrounded by gay-looking sailors.
Life is bare, gloom and misery everywhere, stormy weather, just can't get my poor self together. I'm weary all the time.
And the mask moves through the whole performance. That's Ferdinand and Miranda celebrating their wedding. And then we have the scene that we watched at the start between Prospero and Ariel, or where Prospero is asleep. And again, I think the final thing that I would say about the Tempest is that this, as Ellis says, I basically agree with Ellis that the aesthetic of the play is driving towards a spectacular ending in which the kind of standard moral questions of the play become much less important, and it becomes a celebratory queer spectacle in which the new world which is created in both the play and the film, it's suggested, will be able to contain these potentially antagonistic qualities. And it's that fact, it's this, as Miranda says in The Tempest, this brave new world, the fact of its existence is more important than who will rule where and what position everyone will be in the social hierarchy, which, as I say in in the original Shakespeare play is the driving moral question. And we know in the Shakespeare that that things are in the right place when people occupy the right position, when the nobles are in power, and when the servants are either free or, in the case of Caliban, are good servants and won't be rebellious anymore. In Jarman, we have a much less defined, much more spectacular, much more colourful. We can see that in this image and throughout the Mask vision. And then we return to the idea that perhaps this itself will, when Prospero awakens, will be a world that he's able to live in. And again, we see Ariel's earring is written a lot about in the in commentaries on the film. His slight feminization, his almost bored homosexual presence in the film is something which, if we read the film as a dream, becomes a kind of working through that Prospero goes through with his own desires. And then when Ariel disappears at the end of the film, is he disappearing because Prospero can now inhabit those desires in a way which will allow him to inhabit the kind of colourful community that we see in The Mask? Or is it a more tragic ending to the film? I mean, is Prospero going to wake up just in the old world again? Is he going to wake up at all? Who knows? But I think that this is all of these things are part of the ways in which Jarman queers the Tempest. Okay. We don't have a lot of time, but I want to talk about some of the things in Blue, which is a very different film, those of you who have seen it. But it's also, I think, an extremely beautiful film and very moving. And as a film about AIDS, it's singular. As any film, it's very singular. I would encourage everyone to watch it on the biggest screen that you can find. And to watch it, if you can, without subtitles. Because for the film to do what it can do, you need to be looking at the blue screen for the duration, for the full hour and 13 minutes that the film lasts. And yeah, those of you who have seen it will know that it's a series of speeches and monologues which vary in their subject matter from the banal representation of everyday life, living with AIDS, to quite poetic speeches, to lamentations, to descriptions of the side effects that come with the drugs that Jarman was taking in order to live with HIV/AIDS, which is something that he would eventually die from, as I say, only a few months after the film was released. And this is one of the side effects of this medication was Jarman's eventual blindness, which became first manifest in only being able to see in shades of blue. So if we think about Blue as being a film about representation, or if we think about AIDS as a crisis of representation, then Blue is, I think it's described in this article, which I'll put on eCampus, Tim Lawrence, AIDS and the Problem of Representation in Derek Jarman's Blue. So Blue is described as being a film which is a refusal of representation. It doesn't try to represent the AIDS crisis in any clear way. It doesn't show you the people that Jarman is talking about, and it doesn't show you the body in a state of decay. It doesn't try and move you through images. So in some ways it is a refusal of representation in that sense, but at the same time it's also comes very close to being a representation of the world as it would have appeared to Jarman, and it's a reflection on the world as it appears to Jarman. So it's both a refusal of images, and there's a very moving moment in which we hear the voice talking about a prayer to be released from image.
Blue-eyed boy in a system of unreality. Would all these blurred facts that deceive dissolve in his last breath?
I'll turn it up a bit, sorry.
For accustomed to believing in image, an absolute idea of value, his world had forgotten the command of essence. Thou shalt not create unto thyself any graven image. Although you know the task is to fill the empty page. From the bottom of your heart, pray to be released from image.
So he says, from the bottom of your heart, pray to be released from image. As he's going blind over a kind of purely blue frame, which is all that we see for the totality of the film, this non-moving image of a blue screen. So there is a sense, according to the logic that we hear, that this is the images in some way are deceptive. They represent something which can be mistaken, something which is only a shadow of something which is not the real thing itself. And this, as I'm sure you guys know, this goes all the way back to at least as far back, if not probably further back, than Plato's cave. This idea that what we're really seeing are just shadows and reflections, and that we don't have access to the true thing, and that if we could be released from the images, then we would be able to experience reality as it is. So the film itself becomes a critique of representation, a refusal of representation, and also an act close to a representation of blindness. And there are other ways that representation works in the film in relation to AIDS and in relation to everyday life during the AIDS crisis. And like I say, this is not a film that entirely refuses representation. It's a film which is quite invested in talking about everyday life. And there's a kind of, I would argue, the last thing that I'm going to argue, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this film because it's so hard to talk about. But there is a kind of poetics of everyday life that Jarman is able to extract from his experience of AIDS and of the medication that he's taking. And one of the ways in which he does this is by listing the names of people.
Voices of dead friends. Love is life that lasts forever. My heart's memory turns to you. David, Howard, Graham, Terry, Paul, David, Howard, Graham, Terry, Paul, David.
And if we remember when we were reading Kevin Killian, there's also a clear focus on names and the names of people who kind of emerge into his text who have died as a result of the AIDS crisis. And we have another kind of listing, which is the last thing that I'll play, which is a kind of, again, a kind of poetics, but one that comes from listing the devastating side effects of the drugs that Jarman is taking.
The side effects of DHPG, the drug for which I have to come into hospital to be dripped twice a day, are low white blood cell count, increased risk of infection, low platelet count, which may increase the risk of bleeding, low red blood cell count, anemia, fever, rash, coma, confusion.
And it goes on. And we also hear throughout the film, we hear sound effects that we would associate with a hospital being played alongside moments of music, alongside the sound of nature. So as you're watching, pay attention to the sound. But I also feel as if this moment of listing side effects feels like it verges towards its own kind of poetics and expressing a kind of representation with the reality of living with AIDS within a broader context, which appears to refuse representation, and almost to be a kind of anti-film. Like this Lawrence article says, since its inception, the cinematic medium has relied on thousands of images flying in front of the viewer in order to construct its meaning. And film is defined by its belief in the impact of cascading images. And it is because Jarman increasingly doubted the value of visual representation that he chose to intervene in the medium that is most dependent on image. So he could have made Blue as a book, he could have written Blue as a text, or he could have recorded it as a radio program, but he didn't. He called it a film. And in doing that, the thing, as I say, both the work both seems to refuse representation, and also, I think, in quite important ways, is directly representative of certain realities of Jarman's life, of image in general, and of living in and through the AIDS crisis as a queer person. Okay, guys, so that's it for the course and for the week. So if you want to, I know that lots of you will be working on your presentations and your papers, but as always, if you want to, then you are very welcome to post a response to either the Tempest or to Blue on either eCampus or or you can email it to me. Sorry. And yeah, I hope that you've enjoyed it. I apologize for the disruption again, and also for the fact that, it would be great to meet in person, but that's not how it's worked. I hope that you've got something out of the semester anyway. And yeah, I'm looking forward to reading your presentations. So over to you now. Okay, bye.